This is great. I know a lot of you have studied so much about the assassination, and that's great. And I don't want you to take anything I'm saying today as any kind of indication that I'm trying to say you don't need to look at every little detail. I think we need to continue right on into the future and study all aspects of this case. And it's so important because as the legend over the National Archives said, the past is prologue. You know, if you don't know what happened in the past, you'll never be able to figure out what's going on now or in the future. So I'm not trying to tell anybody that you know, you don't need to go and look into all the little details. So today, what I want to tell you about is just, I want to hit these high spots, because I call this all you really need to know about the assassination. Now, there's so many things we can know. There's so many side trips and so many details. But let's move right along. Okay, what I want to talk about are criminal acts. Fabrication of evidence, suppression of evidence, alteration of evidence, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses. Now we're going to start with fabrication of evidence. We see that on the evening of the assassination, all of the evidence in the case was shipped to Washington to the FBI against the wishes of Captain Fritz, who was in charge of the Dallas homicide, who's actually in charge of the case. This was a Texas homicide, okay? And there were no federal laws about assassination of the president. And Captain Fritz says, well, hey, how can I conduct an investigation when you're taking away all the evidence? But Chief Curry said, okay, as a matter of trying to be cooperative, we went ahead and sent everything to Washington. This is incredibly important. The next day, this document signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself said that no usable prints were found on the rifle or even the inner parts of the rifle. And yet on Sunday, the rifle was shipped back to Dallas. On Monday morning, Vincent Drain and agents Drain and Harrison carried the rifle to Miller Funeral Home in Fort Worth. Here's the old Fort Worth Press that says an FBI team with a crime lab spent a long time in the morgue. And then that evening, Henry Wade said, oh, have we mentioned we've got his fingerprints on the rifle? Well, that seemed to pretty well seal the fate of Oswald in the minds of the public. Paul Grudy, the funeral home director, told me years later, and has said even as recently as a few years ago, unfortunately he passed away about a year or so ago, that I asked him if he was there, and he said yes, and he said the FBI agents put Oswald's dead hand on the rifle, and said in fact he had a tough time getting the black fingerprint ink off of Oswald's dead hand in time for the burial that afternoon. We see here the shell cases. Supposedly they found three shell cases in the depository and one live round in the rifle. If you'll notice the two shell cases on the right and the live round, there is an indentation on the shoulder of the shell casing. The FBI said this was a peculiarity of Oswald's rifle. When you jammed a bullet in there, it kind of crimped the case. You notice this third empty shell casing does not have that crimp. So it apparently was never loaded into the Oswald rifle. And in fact, the Dallas Police Evidence Sheet, as presented by the Warren Commission, shows that they had 3 spent 6.5 rounds. However, in 1991, when they opened up the Dallas Police files, I went over there, I got hold of the original Dallas evidence sheet, and it only showed 2 spent rounds found. So we've got a real problem with this appearance and disappearance of evidence. Here we have apparently the same FBI document signed by Vincent Drain, same file number, same date. One of them says the paper that they found in the book depository matched the paper that they said was the gun case that Oswald had made to slip the rifle into the book depository. This is incriminating against Oswald, of course. The other document, which didn't come out until 1980, appears to be the same document, but it says the paper at the book depository does not match the paper that he made the gun case. You know, what's with that? They actually asked the FBI which one's a legitimate document. And they said, oh, the original one's legitimate, said the other one is a fake document. Well, excuse me, I wonder how many other fake documents are in FBI files. This is a new wrinkle. Dr. David Manick, a very, very prominent and credible physician who has degrees in physics and as a radiologist has done some tremendous work on the Kennedy skull x-ray, where they say there's a small hole that is 6.5 millimeter, which of course incriminates Oswald, who they said has a 6.5 millimeter rifle. But in careful study, and this has been vouched for by other radiologists, this is a fake x-ray. The bullet hole has been superimposed as a double exposure onto the x-ray. This is very telling, okay? Could Castro do this? Could Khrushchev do this? Could the mafia arrange for a phony x-ray of President Kennedy to be placed in the National Archives? In fact, all of these x-rays, there's questions about them. The upper right, you can see the x-ray, and it appears that the whole right front of his head is missing. Big gaping hole there, and yet in the autopsy photograph, that portion of his head, that portion of his temple is perfectly fine. And also over here, we have published accounts from Floyd Reedy, who was the photographer taking the pictures at the autopsy. He says the ones that they're showing us in the National Archives today are fakes, phonies, not the ones he took. Again, can Castro, Russians do that? Here we go. This is Gerald Custer. He's not a researcher or a theorist. He's the guy that took the x-rays of President Kennedy. And he says the ones they're showing you today are not the ones he took. So you can't trust anything that the government says. This is what really bothers me in the research community, is that if somebody in the public tries to say something, I heard this, I know this, they are questioned interminably and picked at, and you know, how do we know this? Can you prove this? And yet these very same people will turn around and quote the Warren Commission as if it's gospel. You can't trust any of this. And of course, we all know the famous diagram of how the magic bullet didn't go. This is critical. This is there's a picture of Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet. That's the one there on the left that supposedly penetrated two men, causing 7 wounds, including shattering the 5th rib of Governor Connally, shattering his right wrist bone, and then ending up in his left thigh. And that bullet doesn't look like it's hit anything heavier than cotton, or more likely water. With a little chip piece off at the top, that's where the FBI chipped off a piece for spectrographic analysis, which they have never completely made public. And that's very telling too, because spectrographic analysis checks the composite of the metal. And J. Edgar Hoover simply sent a letter to the Warren Commission saying, well, it was similar. Well, similar doesn't count. That's like saying the woman is just a little bit pregnant, okay? You're either pregnant or you're not. They either match completely or they don't. And obviously they didn't match completely. The other key thing here is this is a picture of Governor Connally's wrist x-ray. And you can see, I can't get the little thing to go, it's not showing. You can see where the red circle is, that there's some bright spots there. That's bits of metal. There's more bits of bullet that stayed in Connally's wrist than is missing from the bullet the government still says caused the wound. We got alteration of evidence. This gets involved, so I'll try to make it quick. This is a testimony of James C. Cadigan, the fingerprint expert for the FBI. And this was taken in relation to the Warren Commission report. You can see where a portion of his testimony has been scratched out, and somebody wrote in there, no, this is a latent fingerprint issue. And in the Warren Commission, sure enough, we see that they don't have what he actually said. They have no, this is a latent fingerprint thing, okay? And what he covered up, what they took out of there, was the fact that when all of this evidence was with the FBI, in Washington beginning Friday night, lasting through Saturday, Sunday, Monday. There were high-level FBI officials going through it all, and there was no chain of evidence. There was not even any public acknowledgement that they had all of this evidence. It was only on Tuesday following the assassination, after a meeting in the morning with Henry Wade and with the FBI and the Dallas police and sheriff, that they came out and announced the FBI had come into the case. Folks, this is very critical, because this is why there's so much controversy in this whole case, because the FBI had all of the evidence for 3 days with no chain of evidence, no oversight. There's no telling what they put in or what they took out. No wonder it's controversial. Here we see that it was not until November the 27th that we finally learned the FBI had been called in. I can recall at the time they had on the news, they had guys carrying boxes out of the building like, wow, they're all getting the evidence now. They'd already had it for 3 days. This picture to your left is a picture I took before they built the 6th floor. You can see the problem with the window there. At the very bottom, you see a very dark little triangle. That's the floor. So the window is only about a foot off the floor. And the window is only about half open. And there's 2 2-inch pipes just to the left of the window. Makes it very, very difficult for a shooter to try to get an aim down Elm Street there. And you can also see the highway sign, the overhead sign, which was not there in 1963. But you can see that right where that sign is, that's where the first bullet struck. You can also see you got a problem there because that tree interferes with the line of sight. In fact, I was there for when the House Committee was testing the firing in Dealey Plaza for their acoustical test, and I noticed that the sandbags for the first shot were not in the center lane of Elm, which we all know the motorcade was. It was over against the south curb. And when I got a chance to talk to Jerry Compton, the sharpshooter that was actually firing live rounds, I asked him, knowing full well what he's going to say. I said, well, you know, why were those sandbags over there instead of the middle of the street where the car was? He said, well, I asked him to move them. And I said, why? And he said, because I could not get a line of sight into the center of the street. Well, he couldn't at that time, and neither could Oswald. Again, here's what I mentioned. Here's the Dallas Police evidence sheet that shows 2 spent rounds, and here's the Warren Commission replica of that same sheet, so in 3 rounds. You can also notice that down at the bottom on the commission exhibit, it's blank, and down on the bottom of the actual evidence sheet, it says paraffin test made on Oswald was positive on the hands, negative on the face. I have a copy of the complete report, and what it was is they found traces of nitrates on Oswald's hands, but no gunpowder, and no gunpowder or nitrates on his face. Well, I can assure you folks that the only way he could have fired that rifle in 6 seconds is by never lowering it. You have to hold it here, you have to fire, and then you have to cock the bolt, fire, cock the bolt, fire. And if he had done that, his cheek should have been sprayed with gunpowder and nitrates. This is very strong indication he didn't fire a rifle that day. So instead of explaining that, the Warren Commission simply hides it away. And of course, we all know that the Dallas doctors all talked about the gaping wound in the back of his head. And then when the House Committee finally got around to showing us some drawings, it looks like the back of his head's fine, although it is all painted in. But they did show this over here to the left, the little red circle. They said that's the bullet hole. And yet, when the autopsy photographs were finally released, we see there's not a bullet hole there. In fact, you can see hair coming out of that. And as Dr. Hume said, he said, I think that's just dry blood. And I think it is. But again, this is just more conjuring with the evidence. We also know that the back wound was at the third thoracic vertebra, exactly as the autopsy report says. And we also see that they accurately locate that on the diagram of the autopsy face sheet. But the Warren Commission over on the left, see, leaves the circled area there where there's some handwritten notes. They delete that. And what does that say? That says verified Dr. George Berkeley. So what they allowed them to do was to say, well, that's just the face sheet. It's it's not very accurate. because this places the wound in the back at below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the shot came out his throat, which means that if you connect those wounds accurately, that's an upward trajectory. Upward trajectory. Whoa, here's a whole new theory. The assassin was hiding in the trunk. And we've got this verified with his jacket, which shows the bullet hole down in the back below the shoulder blades. And of course they've argued that, saying, well, President Kennedy was waving, and when he waves, his coat rides up, and, you know, and the bullet hole is actually much higher than, you know, well, wait a minute, here's his shirt, also the bullet hole in the middle of the back. So they don't match, but y'all are well aware of that. We've also seen this, and again, the drawing by the House Committee, which has now moved the wound not up in the neck where they said it was, and not in the back where the autopsy said it was. It's over on the shoulder. I'll show you this one real quick, because up to the right is just one of the frames, and you can see what Kennedy's normal head shadow looks like in the dark. And then to the right, you can see there's a big black blob there. 11 Hollywood film and video experts have studied this, and they all said this is a crude forgery, that this black blob was painted on, okay? So they're altering the Zapruder film. The lower picture, this is to put to rest anybody who still thinks the driver shot Kennedy, because as you can plainly see, what they say is a pistol is nothing more than the sun glinting off of the greased hair of Roy Kellerman. You can also see that although the driver Greer, who testified he never looked back, is looking back, but his hands are on the steering wheel, so the driver didn't shoot him. We're now seeing these retrospectives and documentaries where they are using computer analysis to prove that one bullet can go through two men, and that Oswald could have done it all by himself. Well, any computer analysis has to be based on absolute precise numbers, the trajectory, the distances, elevations. In fact, here's my computer simulation. So you went through the tree, hit the sign, back, and hit him in the throat, okay? Hey, don't laugh, a computer did this, okay? Well, we all know garbage in, garbage out. So what point am I making here? I interviewed both of the surveyors, Bob West, who was the surveyor for Dallas County, and Chester Brenneman, his associate, who later became county surveyor at Eastland County. And they both said that the Warren Commission altered their numbers. And this is their original plat sheet that Chester Brenneman allowed me to copy. And you'll notice on here in the circle areas, up here it says this area was hid behind a tree for any shot from the depository as of this date, May '64, when they were doing the work for the Warren Commission. Down here we see the first shot marked by an X, which is further back than the Warren Commission tells us. We see an area of a bullet shot on the curb. Well, nobody's ever talked about that one. And then down here they actually made marks of the yellow marks on the curb. And if y'all don't know about that, you need to go to Dallas and get over there and examine that south curb very carefully, and you're going to find out that there's two little 2-foot strips where you can still see vestiges of yellow paint. And they were there bright yellow that day. And what happened right in, it's really odd, because I mean, if they were painting the curb to yellow, no parking or caution, the whole curb should be painted, but this is just two little stripes. And what happened right in between those two stripes? The headshot. This was marking the kill zone for the snipers. And they marked it on this, but the Warren Commission scrubbed all of this. You don't get to see any of this on this same map that they published. And here's where you can see that they altered the numbers of the Zapruder frames that they were using to do their survey work. So the point is that anybody doing their computer analysis, chances are they're using the Warren Commission's numbers to do their computer analysis, and the Warren Commission changed the numbers. They are not correct. Garbage in, garbage out. You can't trust any of the computer simulations. Of course, we know about the Life magazine and Oswald's picture, and the fact that they said here he is with the guns he used to kill President Kennedy, and this was in February, months and months before they came out with their investigation. And of course, I know you know probably a lot about the study of the backyard photographs, and the fact that Oswald here in the center from his police photographs has a narrow little cleft chin, and yet the figure in the backyard has big, broad, flat chin, and there's a break in the emulsion that goes from one side of the neck to the other. Down here is a copy of what Oswald told Captain Fritz. He said, well, that's my body, but that's not my, and that's my face. He said, that's my face, but that's not my body. And he said, somebody superimposed my face on this photograph, and I've never seen it before. Was he telling the truth? Well, if you'll take the two examples that we know of, 133A and B, turn them into transparencies, lay one on top of each other. These are supposedly two separate shots with a handheld camera. Nothing should match. Oops. Oswald's face is an exact match on both photographs, but it gets better because apparently I don't have it here, but we now know there was a third backyard photograph that was found in the hands of the widow of Roscoe White. And this one, the reason that was suppressed for 15 years and nobody saw it or explained where it came from is because it too, if blown up to the same size and superimposed, Oswald's face is the exact same on all three photographs. That is absolute proof of what he said, that his face was superimposed on somebody else's picture. We got suppression of evidence. We all have seen this, and we all know Jackie Kennedy crawled out on the back of the car. And just think about all of the various opinions and theories about this. Well, she was trying to help Clint Hill. No, she was trying to escape the car. Well, you know, the truth is she crawled out on the rear deck of the car, braced herself, reached out with a hand, picked up a piece of the president's skull, crawled back into the car under her own power. And we know this because Secret Service agent to Clint Hill said she jumped up the seat and she was reaching for something, blah, blah, blah. Pepper Jenkins, doctor at Parkland, said she was holding this in her hand and offered it to him and very dramatically said, here, will this help? So why cover that up? What a dramatic, you know, story about Jackie trying to say, here, can this piece of his head help put him back together again? Well, you didn't hear about that because if she reached a piece of his skull on the rear deck of the car, that obviously indicates a shot from the front. Can't have that. We know the 6 frames are missing from the Zapruder film, and without going into a long story, I was working with Japanese TV and they managed to get a copy of the Zapruder film that did not have the 6 frames missing. I always thought that the 6 frames were missing to shorten up the time frame of the Zapruder film so that it would fit more closely to their single bullet theory. But come to find out, the missing frames, what they show and are missing is a bullet strike on the Stemmons Freeway sign, just as some of the witnesses said. And that sign, of course, was taken down before the end of 1963, not by the State Highway Department, not by the City Department of Dallas, and no one has seen it since. But this, again, there's another shot that has never been explained. We all know, too, that there were witnesses, including Dallas police, who encountered men with Secret Service identification. And there were none officially stationed in Dealey Plaza. All of the Secret Service agents were either in the motorcade or already at the trademark. Here down at the bottom, interestingly enough, when Oswald was confronted by Secret Service Inspector Thomas Kelly, he said, "Are you FBI?" He said, "No, I'm Secret Service." And he blurts out and says, "Well, as I was leaving the depository, a young man, a crew cut, ran up to me, showed me a book of identification, said he was Secret Service, and wanted to know where the nearest telephone was." And Oswald said that he pointed towards the telephone and then stood there as the man actually went to the phone. Now we're told less than an hour later he's accosted by a policeman just down on a street in South Oak Cliff, and he shoots him. This guy says Secret Service as he's trying to escape the building. He doesn't shoot him. In fact, he tells him where the phone is and stands around watching, make sure he gets to the telephone. Is that weird or what? That's right there in the Warren Commission volumes, but nobody ever pays attention to it. Here we go. Here's the third photograph over here to your right with a rifle in his left hand, paper in his right hand. Now, for 15 years, this photograph was unknown, unheard of, found in the belongings of Roscoe White's widow, Geneva. And yet, here's Commission exhibit shows them recreating the backyard photograph, and what pose do they use? The two that were known? No, they're in the pose of the one that was suppressed for 15 years. So obviously somebody at that time knew and had access to this photograph, but it never got entered as evidence, and we don't know about it. This is interesting. This is a picture of Arlen Specter trying to demonstrate his single bullet theory. And you notice he has to hold his straight edge up about 6 inches above the fellow's shoulder to make it work. And yet they correctly located the wound in chalk on the guy's back. So you can see that by his own demonstration, the single bullet theory doesn't work. But of course, we never get told that. Did the Warren Commission understand? Yes, they did. This is the Warren Commission meeting of January the 27th, 1964. This is before they had even really done all their investigating. And J. Lee Rankin, their chief counsel, says, well, it seems quite apparent now, since we have a picture where the bullet entered the back, that the bullet entered below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the picture shows the bullet came out the neckband of the shirt in front. And that bullet, according to the autopsy, didn't strike any bone at all, that particular bullet, and go through. So how it could, and he started to say, how could it twist in midair and go back down to strike Connolly? He realized what he's saying, and he stopped talking, okay? They knew the single bullet theory did not work early on, so they just lied to you. Destruction of evidence. This was a bullet that struck near a manhole cover, not the manhole cover, but near a manhole cover. It was printed in the Star Telegram the next day. It says a bullet lies in the grass across Elm Street, okay? And this is blown up, and it's taken from a printed version. I have seen the glossy photograph. You can actually see the cylindrical slug in the grass. Well, wait a minute, what happened to that? Chief Curry published these photographs in his book, and we see a sandy-haired man that he identified as an FBI agent come. We see that he bends down, picks up this bullet with Buddy Walters and Officer Foster standing over him, who were both assigned to guard this bullet. And this guy, obviously FBI, obviously had more authority. He picks it up, puts it in his pocket. That's the end of that. We know that there was a photograph taken of the back of General Walker's house, which they said they found in Oswald's belongings, and tried to use that to link him to the shooting of Governor Walker. Although Walker told me in the fall of 1964 that the cops told him that whoever shot at him in the spring of 1963 had used a .30-06 rifle. Oswald was never known to have a .36 rifle. Also, though, in the Dallas police photographs, you can see here down at the bottom with a little dotted line, there's that photograph in the Dallas police evidence, and you can see that the photograph is intact. And yet by the time the Warren Commission got it, they'd punched a hole in the license plate so you couldn't find out who that car actually belonged to and find out who might have been mixed up in the General Walker affair. Destruction of evidence. We see at the limousine at Parkland with a bucket of water, and they're putting the top up, and they immediately began to clean that car up. And then Johnson had it shipped and had it rebuilt, and this is blatant destruction of evidence. Of course, we all know about the Hosty note and the fact that Oswald left a note at the FBI. The only person that actually read it or talked anything about it was the secretary, and she said, well, it was some kind of warning. Well, of course, they said, well, yeah, he was warning to stay away from my wife or I'll do something to the FBI. I submit to you that that can't be true, because if it was some kind of threatening note from Oswald, they would have published it on the front page of the Life magazine, right, to show what a bad guy he was. But instead, they destroyed it, had it flushed away. I think it was another attempt at Oswald to warn about what was coming up. Intimidation, suppression of witnesses. Most of you researchers, I don't have to explain that to you. I love Major Phil Willis. I loved him. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but he was the first American to take a Japanese prisoner in World War II. He'd been stationed in Hawaii, and at the attack of Pearl Harbor, they had him out guarding a beach, and there was a little Japanese two-man submarine that got caught in some shell fire, got damaged and was sinking, and the two crew members tried to swim to shore, and one of them drowned, the other one crawled up on the beach, and Willis goes over and takes him prisoner. Interesting. And there he was at the assassination. But I asked Willis to tell me what his experience was like at the hands of the Warren Commission. He said, oh hell, I'd tell them yes, and they'd put down no. So there's the Warren Commission for you. And here's just more witnesses that should have been called and never were. And of course, we've got questions over Oswald's identity, which I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through this pretty much, but there's so many problems. For example, Frank Hudlady, the vice principal at Stripling Junior High in Fort Worth, tells the story that the day after the assassination, his principal contacted him, told him to go to the school and meet with FBI officials that they wanted Oswald's school records. So he went up there, he found all these school records there at Stripling, handed them over to the FBI. The FBI said thank you and took off with them. And to this day, the official Warren Commission and the government says that Oswald never went to Stripling High because he was in Beauregard at the time. So there's too many questions. If y'all really want to get into that, I strongly urge you to read John Armstrong's hard to get and expensive but very detailed book, Harvey and Lee. Even his own mother, as early as 1967, asked to have the body exhumed, wondering about marks and scars on the body. So even his own mother questioned who they had buried in that grave. And Paul Grudy told me that about a week after they buried Oswald, the Secret Service showed up and was asking him questions about marks and scars on the body, and said one of them remarked, we really don't know who we have in that grave. And of course, we've got this picture that's proportionally taken of Oswald about the time he was in Russia, and it's just really odd. You can see one side is heavily in shadow, and the other side is heavily in light, and yet his shadow, the light source seems to be coming from his right, and yet the shadow falls to his left. And we can also see that there's just problems with the face. Look at this, you can see a break in his hairline, you can see a break in the chin, you can see evidence on the lip and the eyebrow that seems to be touched up. And when you separate them then, you've almost got two separate people here. This is a common technique for when you're trying to duplicate someone, and what you do is you put a composite picture together like this, and then you put it on his passport or whatever, and driver's license, and then when they look at it, yeah, it looks like him, but it could actually look like either one of these. I think what we have here is over to the, would be your left, is the real Lee Oswald, born in New Orleans and who went in the Marines. And over here we've got Harvey, who went to Russia, came back. The only person that Marina ever knew, the only person that Judith Baker ever knew, and the one that was killed in Dallas. And here again we can see how they made some composite photographs and how different they look when you separate them. The clincher is the one in the middle. When you line up the eyes, the nose, the mouth, it all looks like it's Oswald, but one of them is about an inch or two shorter than the other. You see the gap up at the top of the head. And just to show you that this is not wild speculation, this is a FBI memo from June of 1960. This is 3 years before the assassination. In this document, J. Edgar Hoover is querying the Security Division of the State Department, and he says that there's a possibility that someone, an imposter, is using the birth certificate of Lee Harvey Oswald, and you know, what information do you have? Whoa! J. Edgar Hoover was personally aware of Lee Harvey Oswald 3 years before the assassination, and in the context of him being impersonated in some intelligence operation. How come nobody gets told that? And I'm not going to run through all these indications of Oswald's innocence, although I will say this. In Captain Fritz's Appendix 11 of the Warren Commission, which is Fritz's report, this is the only word we have as to what Oswald said in his defense, because strangely enough, although the Dallas police held him for almost 3 full days and interrogated him off and on, they said they cut no record of it. There was no stenographic record, there was no notes made, no tape recording. Whoa. But Captain Fritz did type up a report, and when he asked Oswald, where were you at the time of the shooting, Oswald said, I was in the downstairs lunchroom. And for those of you who don't know about how the book depository was at that time, if you went up the front steps, you'd go up a little flight of steps to what I would call the mezzanine, but they called the first floor. But right next to it was a flight of steps that went down, about a half flight of steps, and that went to the basement. And right down there is where they had the domino room, or the lunchroom for the blue-collar workers, who the white-collar workers and the women who worked there did not like to associate with these dirty people who were up handling boxes all day, and some of them were, other than had ethnic problems or situations. And so what they did, the way it worked was they were very good in those days, even though, and keep in mind, in 1963 Dallas, they still had colored restrooms and white restrooms, colored drinking fountains and white drinking fountains, but they were pretty progressive at the book depository. They would allow these workers to go up on the second floor where there was another lunchroom where the vending machines were. So you were allowed to go up there and get a drink out of the machine or food, but then you had to go back and eat it down in the basement lunchroom or the domino room. So Oswald said he was in the downstairs lunchroom, the domino room. And Fritz says, was there anybody in there with you? And he said, yeah, there were these two colored boys that worked at the depository. One of them's named Junior. He said, and the other one's kind of short and stocky. I don't know his name. Well, Harold Norman, who is short and stocky, and Junior Jarman were eating their lunch in the downstairs domino room prior to going up on the 5th floor and getting their pictures taken as they hung out the window there along with Bonnie Ray Williams. So my question is, how could Oswald have accurately described these two guys in this downstairs lunchroom unless he had been there to see them? Furthermore, his clipboard and his jacket were found in the downstairs lunchroom later that afternoon. So we have obvious suppression of evidence, fabrication of evidence, alteration of evidence, destruction of evidence, intimidation, witnesses. These are all criminal activities. They all occurred at the level of the federal government, and this means Lyndon B. Johnson and his next door neighbor and buddy, J. Edgar Hoover, they're the ones in charge. They are guilty as accessories after the fact. And here in Texas, we've executed people who are accessories after the fact. The facts show that they didn't kill anybody, but they hid the gun, drove the car. They knew about the crime. They did not turn anybody in. They're under our legal system, they're considered as guilty as the person who pulled the trigger. So folks, I'm telling you today, it goes above their head and it goes below their head, but two people who could be convicted as accessory after the facts in the court of law are Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. In fact, I'm not the only one to say that. This is a letter from Evelyn Lincoln, Kennedy's personal secretary, and in response to a question about the assassination, she writes that it is, as far as the assassination is concerned, it's my belief that there was a conspiracy because there were those who disliked him and thought the only way to get rid of him was assassination. These 5 conspirators, in my opinion, were Lyndon B. Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, and the Cubans in Florida. Thank you, Evelyn Lincoln. There we have Kennedy assassination solved right there. By the way, his personal secretary, who was with him day and night, probably knew more about him than anybody else. How often do y'all recall seeing an interview with Evelyn Lincoln? It's just not there, is it? And this is why. She knew what was going on. Now, to end this up, I just want to give you the words of John J. McCloy, one of the more powerful members on the Warren Commission, and whose protege was Allen Dulles, who had become head of the CIA. And early on, he said, it was of paramount importance to show the world that America is not a banana republic where government can be changed by conspiracy. Well, folks, I'm sorry, we're just a banana republic. And it was changed by conspiracy in 1963. And you can find all the details in my book, Crossfire, and I thank you for your time.